Welcome to Convention of States, a project of citizens for self-governance. Limited government, checks and balances. The first and most basic principle of the Constitution, the principle of limited government, begins to emerge in the very first three words of the preamble, "We the people." The government of the United States, those three words declare, only exists because we the people choose that it should exist. Thus, the government has no natural or God-given powers. It has only whatever limited powers we choose to give it. The government is not all-powerful. It has no right to try to do more than we've explicitly authorized it to do. It is limited. The principle of limited government expands upon the idea of popular sovereignty, the idea that legitimate political power must derive from the consent of the governed. If the people are the only real source of the government's authority, then the government naturally should have only whatever limited authority the people want it to have. The Constitution is the place where we state clearly and explicitly which powers we choose to give to the government and which powers we refuse to give it. Three concepts are very important to a limited government: separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism. Let's take a closer look at each. Separation of powers. Separation of powers is a doctrine that is often believed to rest at the foundation of the U.S. Constitution. It holds that liberty is best preserved if the three functions of government, legislation, law enforcement, and adjudication, are in different hands. The framers of the Constitution wanted to create a government that was powerful enough to take care of business, but not so powerful that it could threaten tyranny. One key idea in designing such a powerful but limited government was the doctrine of separation of powers. Thus, when they designed the Constitution of the United States, the framers insisted upon the separation of powers. Only the legislative branch, Congress, has the power to make law. Only the executive branch, the President, has the power to enforce and administer the law. And only the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, has the power to judge and interpret the law. Checks and balances. The framers believed their most important action in preventing the rise of tyranny in America was to divide the key powers of the government among the three branches. So the framers carefully constructed a system that provided specific levers of power to allow each of the branches to influence the actions of the others in an orderly and predictable way. Those levers are the system of checks and balances. The core idea of the system of checks and balances was that no one branch of government should be able to get too far out of control without being put in check by the others. The most important result is that getting anything important done within the American system of government typically requires the cooperation, or at least the acquiescence, of more than one branch of government. Americans often complain about the gridlock and inefficiency in their government, but that inefficiency is, to a certain extent, deliberately built into the system. It's the almost inevitable outcome of the system of checks and balances. Checks and balances summary. Here we have a summary of checks and balances for each branch of government. As you can see, the executive branch, legislative branch, and judicial branch. Now this is a summary. Some checks and balances are not reflected. The executive branch actually has some 10 checks. Being commander-in-chief is a major one that's not reflected here. The legislative branch actually has some 22 checks and balances. And finally, the judicial branch actually has some 5 checks. And the last concept, dual federalism. This concept we discussed in our presentation on state sovereignty. Federalism was the last key element important in the system of limited government. Dual federalism is a political arrangement in which power is divided between the federal and state governments in clearly defined terms, with state governments exercising those powers accorded to them without interference from the federal government. In a federal system, some key powers are held by a centralized national government, while others are reserved for the various state governments. Federalism helped to solve the problem. The division of powers between the states and the national government was a kind of compromise, ensuring that states would continue to exercise a great deal of local control even while the new national government would take on more and more responsibilities. Federalism would also provide another kind of check and balance, as the state governments and federal government would both have certain ways to limit and influence each other. As we know, this concept did not last. Let's look now at the founders' positions. Founders' position: Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was one of the strongest proponents of limited government. In a communication to James Madison, Jefferson said, "I like much the general idea of framing a government which should go on of itself peaceably, without needing continual recurrence to the state legislatures. I like the organization of the government into legislative, judiciary, and executive." In another communication, he addressed the will of the people. Quote, "The principle of republicanism is that every people may establish what form of government they please and change it as they please, the will of the nation being the only thing essential." In another communication, he addressed the purpose of government. "The purpose of government is to protect our equal rights," and Jefferson reiterated this on many occasions. Quote, "It is to secure our rights that we resort to government at all." Jefferson's best friend, James Madison, furthered the concept of limited government the most. Founders' position: Madison. James Madison didn't originate the idea of checks and balances for limiting government power, but he helped push it farther than anyone else before or since. Madison insisted checks and balances could help protect liberty in a large republic. Madison developed an early dedication to liberty as a result of his passionate contributions to religious liberty in Virginia. Jefferson shared his passion for religious liberty, and the two became lifelong friends. James Madison went on to develop the idea of, quote, protecting individual rights. Serving in the Continental Congress in 1779 and later in the National Convention of 1787. A key principle supported by Madison was limiting the power of central government through intricate checks and balances. Separation of powers, those who make laws, enforce laws, and interpret laws should be substantially independent and capable of limiting each other's power. Through the friendship of Jefferson and Madison, constitutional checks and balances endure as the most effective means ever devised for limiting government. Power. What has happened? Why have checks and balances broken down? The abuse of power. As James Madison stated in Federalist 47, the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. The founders believed that the structures of a limited government would provide the greatest protection of liberty. Not only were there to be checks and balances between the branches of the federal government, power was to be shared between the states and federal government, with the latter only exercising those powers specifically granted in the Constitution. The protection of liberty requires a strict adherence to the principle that power is limited and delegated. Two key areas where power has replaced checks and balances are the administrative state and state sovereignty. The administrative state. As we determined in our previous presentation, the administrative state, the fourth branch of government, the administrative state violates four constitutional issues. Number one, the administrative state combines the powers of government in the hands of the same officials in violation of the separation of powers principle. Number two, it is based on unconstitutional delegations of legislative power from Congress to bureaucrats and administrators. 3. It violates the principle of Republican government, which requires that power, especially legislative power, be derived from the consent of the governed, expressed directly or indirectly through elections. And number 4, the administrative process that follows to adjudicate disputes is fundamentally opposed to the protections offered by the rule of law in the traditional judicial process. All four of these constitutional issues are alarming, but when they are considered together, it becomes apparent that the administrative state is nothing short of a transformation of the American regime from a republic to a bureaucracy. The very definition, according to Madison, of tyranny. State sovereignty, our loss. As we learned in another previous presentation, state sovereignty, our loss, the states of the United States are supposed to be sovereign entities that run their own affairs with very little to no input or oversight from the federal government. Of course, that isn't how things are run today. The states have completely subjugated themselves to the federal government and allowed its citizens to be ruled. Because the attitude of the judiciary changed toward certain facts of constitutional interpretation, which are, number 1, the federal government is one of enumerated powers only. 2, it is only allowed to spend money for the purpose of carrying out these enumerated powers. 3, within their respective spheres, the two centers of government are sovereign and hence equal. And number 4, the relation of the two centers with each other is one of tension rather than collaboration. In their totality, the judiciary has compromised dual federalism when dealing with the relation between the federal government and the states. With the changes that have happened to the concept of dual federalism, the system has been overwhelmed and submerged. Well, what can we do? For our familiar "what can we do" question, again we can look to some previous presentations for suggestions. Many suggested remedies overlap the four major abuses of our government and are pertinent. First is, of course, an Article 5 Convention of States for the purpose of amending the Constitution. Second would be an oversight committee. All executive branch regulations exceeding an economic burden of $100 million should be subject to review by a congressional oversight committee prior to implementation. Third, a repeal of the 17th Amendment. The Senate was supposed to be a sort of check and balance, but that disappeared when U.S. senators began to be voted into office by special interests and mobs demanding more from the people's treasury. The absolute right of the states to equal representation was wiped out when the 17th Amendment was declared ratified in 1913. The fourth suggestion would be a congressional override. With a 3/5 vote of the state legislatures, states could override federal statutes. And fifth would be clarification of enumerated powers. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. This is just an area that needs to be clarified. Again, these are only suggestions. Actual proposals would be generated by an Article 5 Convention of States. Well, what does this all mean? This is not a partisan issue. Washington, D.C. will never voluntarily relinquish meaningful power, no matter who is elected. The only rational conclusion is this: unless some political force outside of Washington, D.C. intervenes, the federal government will continue to bankrupt this nation, embezzle the legitimate authority of the states, and destroy the liberty of the people. Rather than securing the blessings of liberty for future generations, Washington, D.C. is on a path that will enslave our children and grandchildren to the debts of the past. Well, in closing, I would like to leave with you one of my favorite quotes. The founders gave us a legitimate path to save our liberty by using our own state governments to impose binding restraints on the federal government. It is time to dust off the tool that the founders gave us in Article 5 and get started. Thank you.